Okay, bienvenue. That's first what I wanted to say. So welcome everyone, Sciences Po alumni, but not only. Madame la Présidente also. I am, and on behalf of the French ambassador at Embassy, delighted to be hosting the third edition of the Sciences Po Transatlantic Forum here at the Résidence de France, and indeed it's a nice season to organize it. And I used to be, when it was like a century ago, and I was also a Sciences Po graduate myself. So, we don't hear me.
No, it's in here.
Hello. You have to have the sound. So I graduated not a century ago, but I did Sciences Po in the last century. So it means a lot to be here among so many of you, young, less young, but vibrant, especially smart people. And the relationship between the US and Sciences Po, France's most renowned university for political science and international relations, grows stronger every year thanks to your efforts and commitments, with, I was told, 1,500 Sciences Po alumni in this area, so DC, Meridian and Virginia alone. So bravo and congratulations, and it's such a pleasure to have you tonight. And tonight is also an opportunity for us to reinforce our transatlantic relations, connections, if we are speaking about probabilities. And I want to thank our panelists that are not there on stage, but are very interesting, and I'm sure we have a fantastic discussion about cities and climate issues, and they will line up for you on sustainable urban mobility, and that is definitely the future for all of us and for our planet. So thank you so much in advance. Indeed, tonight's discussion is more relevant than ever, as this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Paris UN Climate Conference, Les Accords de Paris. In addition, Paris recently passed the Olympic torch on to Los Angeles in preparation for the 2028 Games, and cities across the US are preparing to host visitors from all around the world during the coming decades of major sporting events, beginning with the FIFA World Cup 26. And you will see a lot of Europeans around, not only French, but you can support, of course, the French team. And we hope the best anyway. Let's be sporty. So with these exceptional events comes an exceptional opportunity to improve all the ways that both visitors and residents get around the cities. So it's not only a matter of daily life for Americans, that is very important. It's also how you can, in fact, accommodate tourists from Europe and even beyond. When we provide people with safe, efficient, and sustainable transportation that connects them to opportunities and services, including jobs, housing, education, healthcare, and leisure activities, we help communities thrive. Interesting enough, one of the issues on the Council of Ministers in France tomorrow will be about also the policy of cities. So we have a little bit in advance with the Council of Ministers. I don't know whether somebody wants to make a report and send it to Presidents Macron and Andrei. Anyway, we hope that tonight's discussion will offer some food for thought, and I'm sure it's not only a hope, it's a certitude, as well as concrete opportunities to shape local policy and craft innovative and lasting mobility solutions for all. And I want again to take this opportunity to thank our panelists and Ali, who is just on my left, the Executive Director of Sciences Po American Foundation, who is really doing a fantastic job, for making this event possible and for fostering such a vibrant alumni, as we have seen just at the very beginning, networking in the US. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Anne. Thank you so much.
Thank you on the kind words and the introduction. I'm going to be very brief. First of all, because I know no one is here for me, but either for the speakers. Thank you, Polly, for coming today. Thank you, Petra, and thank you, Andrei. And I know that we always in exposé champagne. So, the Sciences Po American Foundation channels Sciences Po's reputation and influence in the U.S. Our ambition is to position Sciences Po as a leading university, offering a European view on global affairs. We leverage the alumni network, we enable transatlantic conversation, and we foster deeper understanding and collaboration. Today, by joining our initiative, you actively support the Sciences Po American Foundation and our ambitions. You support this U.S. Scholarship Fund and the Transatlantic Research Fund, and you help strengthen the ties between France and the U.S. I want to say a special thank you to you for coming, for showing up, for the support, for your presence, and even more especially, thank you to our Club 150 members, because this is how we can continue nurturing the network and support Sciences Po. Tonight is the third annual DC Transatlantic Forum. It's our flagship event in DC. I'm sure everyone is extremely happy that we moved the event from November to June. I'm extremely happy about this. I'm going to skip a little bit what I wanted to say because Anis did a great job introducing the panel. And I am going to welcome Max Bouchet, who is going to lead the conversation. I met Max 10 years ago. He volunteered to help organize gatherings from the Sciences Po community while working in Atlanta, and he continued later on in DC. Since then, he passed the baton to Andy and Megan. Thank you, both of you, for continuing the mission and for your support, for your supportive presence. Max is the director of Subnational Diplomacy at the Meridian International Center. He has the deep expertise in connecting city, state, and local leaders to global opportunities. From his work at Brookings to his leadership at the Truman Center, he has now shaped the field of subnational diplomacy, building bridges across borders to tackle our most pressing global challenges to local action.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone, for being here. This is a very cozy panel. Thank you. Be very close to each other. And Petra, please watch out for sharing behind you. Thank you, Anne, for the warm welcome, and thank you for Ambassador Van der Woel and the embassy for hosting us tonight. And also special thanks to the team at the embassy, transportation policy, especially Pauline Wong, who helped shape this event. And thank you all for being here. So my name is Max Bouchet, and I'm really thrilled to join this panel tonight. Is this working? Or is
Sometimes.
my voice is sorry. How about this one? Yep. Thank you. So as the ambassador said, but let's go back to last summer. We still remember the very colorful closing ceremony of the Paris Olympics. And you might also remember the mayor of Los Angeles, Mayor Karen Bass, in Paris, receiving the Olympic flag at the end of the ceremony and taking it back to LA to prepare to hosting the Games 2028. And besides the flag, we can imagine that Mayor Bass also left Paris with some thoughts about the challenges and opportunities of hosting the game. As the ambassador said, moving 10 million visitors in the city, and a blueprint of the games in Paris has been this incredible acceleration of the transformation of urban mobility in Paris starting years ago. And as the ambassador said, urban mobility is really pervasive. It really touches every part of our lives, not only how we move, but also health, public safety, climate, equity. And to shed lights on these issues and opportunities, we have an extraordinary panel with decades of experience in transportation across governments, at the federal, at the local level as well, across business, and also associations. So to start with, Polly Trottenberg on my right, until January 2025, Polly was the Deputy Secretary at the Department of Transportation. So Polly was the second in command under Secretary Buttigieg. And before this, Polly was the Transportation Commissioner of New York City. I think it's hard to fathom the scale of the operations. New York City, 6,000 miles of roadways. The number of bridges is staggering. I think it's more than almost 800 bridges. And I think that Paris has just 37 bridges, which older, but smaller. Thank you, Polly, for being here. Andrei Greenawalt. Andrei is the Chief Policy Officer at VIA, which is a leader on on-demand transit, which develops digital solutions to public transportation, working with US cities and states all across the US. And you've been at VIA for 8 years. Before then, you held multiple positions at the White House on policy. And also worth noting that in November 2024, Secretary Buttigieg demoted you to an advisory commission on transportation. Does this advisory group still exist?
I don't think so.
We'll discuss. We'll discuss.
Very well last.
Last but not least, Petra Mollet, who is Vice President for Strategy and International Programs at the American Public Transportation Association, APTA, a platform for public and private transportation organizations to promote public transportation, which is really in the trenches in the US. Dating back 1882 in Boston, named then the American Street Railways Association, and the first meeting of the association was focused on the price of oats that horses were able to pull the train vehicle. So we came a long way. Thank you for being here, and we'll actually start with you. You came back from you have a long experience in Europe, and you actually came back from a mission in Europe with the association releasing fascinating insights in the reports looking at Paris and London transit systems. And so we'll start this panel by doing a bit of contrast between the US and Europe on how you approach transportation. So what struck you most in Paris and London about the differences of how we approach public mobility across the Atlantic?
Thank you, Matt, for that question, and very good to see all of you this evening. Look forward to talking to you afterwards. There were a few things that I'd like to point out, and maybe more from a governance and policy perspective to start off with, since we are in a political science environment here. But the first, and this is all debatable, so I'd be happy to debate afterwards, but I think, one is that fundamentally, certainly when you look at France, urban mobility is seen as a key policy lever to meet environmental, economic, and regional cohesion goals. And, and there's an alignment there in terms of urban mobility as a lever and how it's then institutionalized in the governance structure. The Ministry of Transportation is within the Ministry of Ecological Transition and Regional Cohesion. I mean, that already says a lot in terms of what the goals are. But it's also in terms of how public transportation is funded in France with the versement de transport, so the mobility tax, which is a payroll tax essentially on businesses with over 11 employees. Again, very coherent, saying that you cannot have businesses that thrive in a country if you do not have good urban mobility infrastructure, and hence we need to fund that through our businesses as well. In London, I would say equally, when you look at some of the mayor's transportation strategy in London, it's very ambitious. By 2041, have 80% of all people in London and Greater London area using either public transportation or active transportation. So you can very ambitious goals linked to climate goals, environmental goals, equity goals, etc. The second thing I'd like to mention is the way that urban mobility is governed in these two cities. they have very integrated regional authorities that oversee transportation. Now, that's the case in some areas in the United States as well, but it's more an exception than a rule. And it means that they really have all the tools to be able to meet these policy goals. Île-de-France Mobilité and the greater Paris region oversees all the public transportation modes and also sets the price, sets the quality goals, etc. Does studies on investment where investment needs to be. Transport for London is arguably one of the largest integrated transportation authorities in the world, and it has oversight over the roads. It has oversight over all the public transportation infrastructure, but also ride-sharing, taxis, bike share. Again, we're a little bit more siloed in our approach here in the United States, and I think that's a lesson learned in terms of being able to move fast, but also take a very long-term view in terms of planning. The third thing, if I may, I'd like to mention is also in terms of a resource implementation. Certainly when you look at those two cities, they are really investing not only in riders of today, but they're investing in their inhabitants in terms of how they'll move tomorrow. And again, we do that here as well, but I mean, it does strike me that Paris is doubling its metro network by 2031, the called Paris Express. I mean, that's an enormous undertaking. It's probably one of the biggest infrastructure projects in Europe. I can't remember if it's number one or number two. But both cities are, doing a complete transition of their bus fleets. I mean, London has 9,000 buses, all to zero emissions, again, with an eye to the future. And then there's so many things we don't see in the background, which is updating signaling systems of the oldest metro systems in the world, bringing in new rail cars, etc. We have certainly here made a big historic investment, over $200 billion going into our transportation infrastructure through the bipartisan infrastructure bill. But we still have a huge backlog of over $140 to $150 billion in just keeping our system in a state of good repair. And we did, for public transportation, still just get a D from the American Society of Civil Engineers. So we have a lot of work to do here, so the investment must continue. So just a few broad statements here to start off the conversation.
Thank you, Petra. Tony, on the same perspective around what works in Europe. You mentioned earlier to me that you spent some time in Paris meeting with Meridian Hidalgo. Maybe from your American perspective, what are all the things that Europe gets right and that American cities may be still struggling with?
First of all, thanks also. This is a lovely event. Thanks to the ambassadors, residents, and Mrs. Bo and Max, thanks to you and my great colleagues here. We've all worked together for a lot of years. I think Petra kind of laid out some of the things that Europe gets right. They have a much more sort of unified, coherent approach to transportation planning and transportation funding. Petra described the U.S. system as stovepiped. It's stovepiped, but it's also, I think, complex and distributed. And we're a pretty big and complex country, so I don't want to say that that's all necessarily bad. When I was transportation commissioner in New York City, I didn't get that much state and federal money, but that gave me also a lot of freedom to do a lot of what I wanted to do and to remake the streets. And obviously, as we can all acknowledge at this moment during our transatlantic dialogue, it's a complicated time in American politics. And we're very polarized, and we're sort of going through, I think, sort of very different approaches from administration to administration. So to the extent that our system is decentralized and devolved, that's a little bit to our benefit. I don't mean to say, though, that it is better than the levels of investment and commitment that you see in Europe. But, Petra, you're mentioning what's happening in Paris or what's happening in London. In my time in New York City, we finally got around to building 3 stops of an extension to the Second Avenue subway. It took years and years and years. And, if you spend time in New York City, you sort of realize when you look at that, that's what New York City should be doing every year. That's the level of investment that's needed. And, just an extraordinary statistic, because you mentioned all the bridges in New York City, just something that I like to talk about. There was a time in New York City when we were potentially going to meet, those of you who are familiar with the city, shutting down a subway line that was damaged during Hurricane Sandy, the L train, which runs across Manhattan and into Brooklyn. The L train, during the peak hour, carries more people than, you mentioned the bridges that the New York City DOT owns, then, if you're familiar with New York City, then the Queensboro Bridge, the Williamsburg Bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, the Queens Midtown Tunnel, and the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. I mean, just the sheer efficiency of the New York City transit system and of Paris and London is astonishing. And so, unfortunately, even as Petra mentions, I think with the great investment that we did get in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're still not investing in anywhere near European levels. And certainly to tackle climate and continue, I think, the urban mobility we need, we're not investing at that level.
And then we'll discuss the funding gaps and the political load as well. And then on that same question, what do you see as European cities leading on, but also on the other side, what is uniquely American about mobility that European cities can learn about?
In fact, Max is trying to get me in trouble here with this first march. This is like the best time. People are, oh, well, you have an American, and Europe can do things better. But I'll give it my best shot. Just very quickly, why I even have any perspective on this. To say a little quickly about VIA. We're a technology company that works with cities to improve public transit across the world. We have about 650 partnerships now with cities in 40 different countries. Hundreds of those are in the US, but we also have dozens of partnerships in France. And it's everything from Petra mentioned Transport for London. Many of the biggest transit agencies use our software planner systems like Transport for London, the MTA, WMATA here in DC. We improve paratransit systems. So we are now the technology platform for those of you who don't know what paratransit is, it's a specialized transportation for people with disabilities. We now power the entire city of Paris and the surrounding areas paratransit system. So we work with Paris on that. And then we run a bunch of, Max mentioned on-demand transit systems, which are, if you imagine, instead of a large fixed route bus, a city investing in having vehicles that are smaller that people can summon on their phone, much like an Uber, but it's public transit. It's shared. You can take it from any corner in the city to any other corner in the city. So why do we have dozens in France instead of like hundreds in America? I think a couple of things. In some ways, the lack of investments in the US, especially outside of our biggest cities, sometimes makes it easier to innovate. So the first city we ever launched in was Arlington, Texas. 400,000 people. For decades and decades, the largest city in America with no public transit. I mean, that's like unheard of in France, that you would have a place of 400,000 people, and probably a place of 50,000 people. It's unheard of that you would not have significant transit. So, is that good that for decades they didn't have public transit? No, I would argue that was not good. But it makes it easier for them to, when a new solution comes along, adopt that solution, think creatively. And now they have, 100 on-demand transit vehicles. You can get anywhere you want to Arlington for $3 to $5. You get it on your app, and that's their entire bus system, is this on-demand transit system. So in some ways, that's a condition that makes it a little easier, to innovate in the U.S. outside of the New Yorks and the D.C.s. If you look at sort of how the industry is in France is on the transit front, has been dominated for years by a set of particular providers and operators of transit. So companies that you probably heard of, like Keolis and Transdev and others. And I think that has a lot of benefits, but it can also make it maybe a little bit harder to be nimble and to innovate and to kind of try new solutions, because there's a certain way of doing things, and that's how it's worked for a long time. And then the last thing I would say is, I think in the US, this has been true under both Democratic and Republican administrations, there's been sometimes these very focused on innovation competitive grant programs that have helped jumpstart a lot of innovation in many, many spaces, but including in public transit. So this example I mentioned, Arlington got money at the end of the Obama years. It also got money in the first Trump administration, and that helped them sort of have the courage to try this new thing out and do it. You see that also in Germany. There have been a lot of investment in innovation, maybe a little bit less so in some other countries in Europe.
Thank you. There's a way really to the Olympics, and really there was so much conversation around the Transatlantic cooperation on the Olympics, and the great opportunity that such a major event represents for a city. And so we are seeing players taking advantage of those moments to accelerate progress. Petra, let's start with you. What does it take to take advantage of a pivotal event like the Olympics to rethink urban mobility in the longer term?
Well, aside from, of course, doing some big projects, splashy projects, I think it is an opportunity, and I've just benefited from listening to a lot of the American cities for wisdom, FIFA, and of course LA, in terms of how they're approaching this. But it's an opportunity when you get a global audience to think about your system anew and afresh in terms of, if you do not speak English or you're coming to a city for the first time, how do you access the system? How do you buy a ticket? How do you find your way through the system when you don't speak English or French? In Paris, for example, Paris had some very good symbolism, right? With all the pink logos everywhere, you could find where you needed to go. How are you going to get crowds from one to another? How are you going to create redundancy in your system? And how will you integrate your system? Again, some of the systems that will be hosting some of these events have some gaps in terms of how to get people from A to B. So it is an opportunity to look at that. And really make some refinements to your system. And the other is, I think, from an accessibility perspective as well. Of course, the Olympics comes with the Paralympics, and is your system completely accessible for the spectators who are going to come? So those are just some first spots, I think, in terms of how systems are thinking about creating the legacy for afterwards.
And maybe if you talk about different timelines, because we saw that in Paris, this accelerated transformation also came with tensions, the polarizing views between the place of individual cars in the city or never-ending construction work in the city. So how can a political leader manage at the same time the short-term need to deliver for a particular event, but also thinking about the long-term quality of life of residents?
Oh, it has to actually do this.
So I am lucky, admittedly, because I was in Garce. I do get to meet with Mayor Hidalgo, who in urban transportation circles, of course, she's so widely respected and she's done incredible things as Paris was preparing. So, and look, Paris did some fantastic things. I mean, the work on sustainability, the investment in transit, cycling. I mean, I think Paris was already doing a lot of exciting transformational things, and I think to the credit of the mayor, a lot of national leaders, they seized the moment. LA is obviously trying to do the same. You know, it's a challenging moment for Los Angeles because of what's happened there with the fires. And, you know, I think they had sort of similar Paris-like vision, you know, including what they were saying, 28 and 28, which is 28 amazing transit projects to be done basically in the span of about a decade, which is ambitious under good circumstances. But I think, unfortunately, the city's facing some challenges with recovering from the fire and some budgetary and political turmoil. But I think, as you were saying, it does, for better or for worse, the Olympics now, and I think the way you see that sort of city leaders have to sell into their cities, is they have to promise some pretty transformational things are going to come out of them. You know, a city that I'm familiar with, Boston, was a city where they kind of failed to do that. So, and now they have to deliver. And look, I think LA will deliver a lot. It will, you know, maybe not every part of their ambitious, will every single trip during the Olympics be car-free in Los Angeles? I don't know. It's a tall order from that city, which is obviously much bigger and sprawling than Paris, but I think they're going to accomplish a lot of exciting things.
I'm obsessed with the Olympics, so I'm happy to. And we won't talk Olympics after this. Or it's also the World Cup, the weird for Clatini, you know, that is. But yeah, Petra mentioned sort of like, you know, how do you navigate a city? And we, a couple of years ago, we acquired a company called City Mapper. I don't know if anyone heard of it, but it's a journey planner app. So you use it to navigate your cities. Let's say instead of Google Maps, they are used by you. More than 1 million people on Terrace use City Mapper. We're actually sitting next to what used to be New York's #1 user of City Mapper.
And a big fan of City App.
I say that not because we track her, but she told me. But we actually partnered with Paris and the Olympics and with the Ministry of Transportation on getting people who are attending the Olympics to adopt City Mapper and navigating the city and doing things like sending people who were working in office buildings on a different route than some of the attendees, because that's what Paris wanted to do. We did things like, depending on what gates you were entering the venue, we would specifically direct you to a certain exit, you know, in the metro stop. And there was a lot of work that Paris did on accessibility. I thought, to me, by all accounts, Paris did an unbelievable job on the transportation front. And I was just in Salt Lake City recently, and that city, I actually attended the Salt Lake Olympics, the only Olympics I've ever attended in 2002. I mean, their entire transportation system practically is based on their investment in the Olympics, and they have a Winter Olympics, another one coming up in the 2030s. So it can be hugely transformative if the opportunity is grasped.
And I'll just point to add on City Mapper and its utility, because Petra, you're talking about the challenge of how do you have an app that is in the right language. I mean, one thing I have to say, City Mapper's done very well because I've used it all over the world, and it manages to translate itself from whatever is the local language and get you the right direction. So I do think like there are some pretty exciting technologies out there now to help make these events, you know, much more seamless in terms of transportation.
It's not big, yeah.
You mentioned so the work in Paris and the progress that have been made, but it seems that the solutions in an American environment would be different. Paris, for instance, actually the number of cycling lanes, for instance, but the context to public start is different because of the density of the city and the proximity of work and residence. So for an American city like LA, I mean, the solution I imagine is not about just opening cycling lanes to connect to different neighborhoods, right? How does this transfer into an American context of urban sprawl, for instance?
Well, I mean, if you spend time in LA in maybe sort of the past 15 years, LA has actually done a lot to transform itself into a cycling city. It's had some great leadership, mayors and transportation commissioners. So you need to sort of get a little bit of the stereotypes of LA out of your head. It's much more of a cycling city actually than it used to be, and they have invested a lot in their metro system. It doesn't have the ridership over Paris or New York, but the city has done a lot to try and sort of change its DNA from being a completely auto-dependent city. That said, you're not going to be able to bike to all the venues in LA for the Olympics. In LA, you know, their commitment was to have a car-free Olympics in which all the buses would be zero emissions. You guys may know more than me about whether they're quite going to get there. In the U.S., we're having some challenges producing those zero-emission buses, but I think it's the right goal for LA, and I think hopefully they'll get pretty close.
I just wanted to add something intangible about the Olympics, which I also heard. I was here 2 weeks ago and benefited from listening to a panel here at the embassy about the Paris Olympics. And, you know, if you speak to anyone who actually was there and rode the system, there was an emotional connection. People were very proud. I mean, Paris really delivered, and it delivered in great part because the transit system worked well, the urban mobility system worked well. LA understands that, and they're as much focused on making sure the experience for visitors from overseas is going to be a positive one, as they are about making sure it's a good experience for the residents of LA who may never have stepped on any part of the system before, whether it's a bicycle or whether it's the metro or light rail or bus. So for them, it's an enormous opportunity to introduce their inhabitants to what I'd say a sustainable urban mobility lifestyle is like, and perhaps keep that. That could also be part of legacy.
Something also I'm ready to discuss is around this idea that cities, at the local level, cities are natural collaborators. Mayors, we love to hang out and learn from each other. And so you mentioned the level of Paris and LA, for instance, earlier. Can you elaborate a bit on this idea that at the subnational level, ideas and best practices on urban mobility are transformed and learned from each other? And what makes innovation stick from one environment to the other?
Okay, I can start. It's interesting when you look at VIA's kind of deployments in various countries. If you're just looking at a map with some dots, like you see that these clusters start to develop. So like northern Texas is a huge cluster of services that are unmanned because a couple of places started. The mayors talk to each other, they see each other at conferences, they see news articles, they see a mayor standing out there and claiming this as a big success. And they start to look into it and adopt it. So we definitely see that sort of organic growth in different areas, which I think is interesting. I'm creating the second part of your question.
So just this idea of how cities are ready from each other, and then sort of is a mayor going to the city and stealing good ideas, what makes innovation replicable in different contexts, especially when you think about the cultural differences, also how we consider urban mobility.
I think, sorry, you should remind me. Yeah, I think the second point I would just make is when you provide excellent transit, it's extremely, at least what we like to call it, like sticky. You know, whether it's like an innovative solution or non-innovative solution, when people start to rely on it, I think it tends to sort of build on itself and have a domino effect. So the locality and the region want to invest in it more because it's a success, and it's just this virtuous cycle of ongoing investment. So I think that is, I think that's another thing that sort of like, you know, happens and helps build these like clusters around the country and around the world.
I don't know if I can directly answer your question, and if I don't work as much with mayors perhaps, but I do work a lot with transit professionals, and I have the pleasure for the last 10 years of taking at least once a year a group of transit professionals overseas to see what's happening around the world. And I can tell you, they come back with ideas, and those ideas are implemented. And sometimes it's not even a technology; it may just be a practice that they heard and realized how to do it differently. But you know, I distinctly remember our first trip to London in 2015. We were talking about funding and financing. London was using green bonds to finance their transit system. Seattle was on the trip. They went back and decided they could do it as well. So sometimes it's just showing what's possible. I'd say there's a little bit of hopefully, I'd say an evolution, if not a revolution underfoot here in terms of how we use land around transit. We have the concept of transit-oriented development, but there's still laws in quite a few jurisdictions that don't quite allow for transit agencies to leverage that real estate. Yet when we look at places all over Asia, and certainly Paris and London as well, they're making good use of that land to create more affordable housing, to create, places for business, etc., small business as well. And they're leveraging that to get more revenue for the transit system. And we're seeing many agencies here start to work with their local government structures to alter these ordinances to allow for more of that to happen. So again, I'd say that's a direct result of seeing what's possible elsewhere and having that conversation.
Let's just add a few more thoughts about kind of collaboration between cities. Certainly when I was transportation commissioner in New York City, there's a group a lot of you probably read NACDO, which is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. And it's just a fun club to be in. Just great to spend time with your fellow commissioners. It used to sort of be mainly in larger cities. It's now grown the organization's grown bigger, and it's kind of mid-sized cities. But it's not only a wonderful opportunity for the leaders of transportation agencies, but for their whole teams. And there is, I think, just incredible collaboration and cross-pollination. And honestly, the opportunity also to, a lot of cities, we were grappling with the challenges of our bike share systems and changes in management and how we make sure that we cut good partnership deals. You might have chatted about VIA once in a while, but they are operating. So it's, and we were very closely tied to each other during COVID and what happened here with George Floyd. I think those are essential pieces of collaboration. I also did luckily get the privilege, I've gotten to spend time with transportation officials in a lot of European cities, and particularly in New York City. We were the first big city in the US to do Vision Zero. And so I will always remain especially grateful to my Swedish counterparts. Visited them in Stockholm and Gothenburg, and just they were so generous in sharing all the insights that they had. And, Sweden has an extraordinary roadway safety culture. So just tremendous learning there. I'll take perhaps just also to brag on my administration, the Biden administration, because one thing we also tried to do with some of our grant programs, particularly like Safe Roads and Streets for All, was to create a community of practice for smaller communities that haven't typically accessed federal dollars, which, it's not easy in an American context to win federal dollars and to manage all the requirements. So we did at the federal level also try and nurture that community of practice and that sharing. It's that model's a little bit under threat at the moment, but I'm hoping, building those relationships, using maybe smaller communities in Texas, or just that there are natural places where communities can learn from each other and, buck each other up and give each other good advice in challenging moments.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one last question, but then we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So please prepare your questions, and I think we might have a mic that will submit, or I will pass this one. One last question, and maybe starting with you again, Polly. You mentioned the political moment where we are in, and we talked about infrastructure investments. I also the funding freeze over some of the investments, the layoffs at the DOT, potential roadblocks at the state level for efforts on EV or the position around the climate agenda as well. So a lot of issue that seems to create concern over the future of sustainable urban mobility in the US. How concerned should we be?
It's a complicated question. Well, we'll talk a little bit, again, as we sort of started this conversation, sometimes one of the strengths, but also one of the weaknesses of the US system is that it is federated and diffuse and you have multiple levels of government. So I think let's sort of start with the good news, which is I think a lot of urban innovation and investment on the technology front is going to continue to happen, kind of regardless of what happens here in Washington. It may or may not have more robust funding, but, when I was transportation minister in New York City, as I said, I didn't get much of my funding from the federal government or from New York State. A lot of it was local. For smaller communities, that can be more difficult, but I think that will continue. And I'll give one exciting example from my city. Obviously, New York has managed to implement congestion pricing, and it has been more success. It took many, many years. I was involved in it at the local level, up in Albany, here in Washington. It took many, many years. But I think it has been, by many accounts, tremendously successful. It's raising hundreds of millions of dollars for the transit industry. It's reducing congestion. It's improving air quality. It's increasing roadway safety. It's reducing noise. People now in Manhattan, it's less noisy. There's just less honking and, it's very noisy in New York City. People were worried that it was going to hurt local businesses and hurt Broadway. So far, it hasn't seemed to do so. That's not to say there are people who are paying now and it isn't a hardship for some, but it is kind of a big, bold experiment. It's a little bit under threat, but I think it has shown that at the state and local level, we can do more of that. And, one sort of political discussion that's underway, some in this audience may have heard these books like Abundance by Ezra Klein and Why Things Don't Work by Mark Dunkelman, which is calling on those of us who believe in government to sort of investigate why it isn't delivering better, why it isn't delivering more green infrastructure or more affordable housing or, transit projects on time and on budget. And for me, I think that's kind of an exciting assignment for those of us who believe in government. And some of that's federal, but a lot of that is also state and local. At the federal level, I think the good news, I'm sure Petra will talk about this, the president's skinny budget is out and transportation's doing okay so far, as far as we can tell. So perhaps it still remains somewhat of a bipartisan issue, but I think it's early days in the budget process, so we shall see.
Yeah, and maybe I can just follow on that. Certainly, yes, right now we are seeing bipartisan support. And as we look to a new federal funding bill for surface transportation, the current one will expire next year. We are getting signals from both sides of the aisle that there is support to continue, perhaps not at the levels of investment we saw in the last bill, but continue to support urban infrastructure for mobility. But I'd also like to mention something else you said, Polly, about the local level and the support there. Lots of cities will do referendums to raise taxes to finance their urban mobility structures, particularly public transportation. And we've seen a good average of about 87% of those referendum at the local level being passed in the last 5 to 10 years, which means, again, there is political support and commitment from the population to, I'd say, citizens to vote for paying for good infrastructure for the urban mobility. So I think that's another positive sign.
I think they stated it all very, very well. I think I do think in this age where there are cuts happening across the government, I thought it's been this very strong focus on cut. I do think it's notable that transit is not being cut, and that Trump's proposed budget that actually has a slight uptick from the spending last year. Now, to Polly's point, there's a long process to play out with Congress, actually passing something, but I think that's notable. We also did a survey that looked at all of our deployments across the country, and it's interesting. Almost exactly 50% of them are in Democratic districts, almost exactly 50% in Republican. And so I think at the local level, there's strong interest from both parties in providing economic mobility for their residents. And so maybe some focus on climate, some don't, but everyone can agree on access to jobs and education and healthcare.
I actually, Andrei, just raised something I was a little remiss in. My sister.
Just base one.
Is this one better? Can you all? No. Yeah. Raise a charm? All right, I'll just talk loud.
Yeah.
I mean, as much as perhaps the funding picture does not look that bleak, we're here in Washington, and I do want to take a moment to acknowledge, though, that what's happening with the federal workforce is profound. And USDOT is going to lose thousands of experienced people, incredible knowledge and experience. So we'll see what happens on the budget front, but what's happening with the federal workforce is some pretty irreparable harm, I think, and something a lot of us in this city are pretty concerned about.
Do you see local governments actually hiring
Absolutely. No, to the credit of a lot of state and local governments and transit agencies, they've really tried to step up and make space and try and hire folks. But they're going to start feeling the squeeze too, as federal dollars in healthcare and other areas are going to start to shrink. So we'll have to see how it all plays out economically. But I do think, at least in the transportation world, and I think this is true in other parts of the economy, agencies, I have to say, to their credit, as soon as, at least in the Biden administration, we lost the election, I got a lot of phone calls from fellow transportation leaders around the country offering to try and help, and they've stepped up and done that.
All right, so we'll move to questions. We have one question right here. Thank you.
Merci, thank you. My name is Mercedes. A question with regards to two technologies, AI, and then also remotely operated cars, such as Waymo and so on, which as bicyclists are going to actually be safer than normal vehicles. But if you could speak to whoever would like to, how you see AI and remotely operated vehicles impacting transportation planning, safety, however you think that may move forward. Thank you.
Yeah, give a tech guy will kick us off.
Yeah, I think autonomous vehicles presents a huge opportunity if we embrace them in the correct way and we use them as a form of shared mobility and public transit. I think conversely, if you just imagine all of us coming to this event and we all have our own private autonomous vehicle and we're like, hey, why don't you just circle the block for 2 hours while we come into this building, right? You can just quickly imagine sort of is this working? Yes. You can start quickly imagining, the congestion and traffic issues that would cause. I think there are huge potential for state rise and the safety front, but I think this question of exactly how we regulate them, and then also, there's been a lot of conversation on, I think there's been less conversation about once they're ready, and Waymo has made huge advancements. I think once they're ready to be here en masse, I'm not sure we're really prepared for that moment about how they're actually going to be deployed en masse in our cities. But I'm sure these two have interesting perspective as well on it.
AI? No. Thoughts on AI?
Well, autonomous, I would say, is one form of deploying AI. I think I struggle with AI because I feel like everyone has a different definition of it. See, from everything from sometimes people describe it as just overlaps exactly what technology is. But I do think there's, certainly in our company, we're using AI to, our hundreds of engineers that we have developing algorithms are using AI to do that faster and better. And so I do think there are huge opportunities to, improve transportation if we use that well.
I think there's no question when you see the technology, it's incredible. As you say, a company like Waymo, the advancements they've made are pretty astonishing. To me, I guess, and this was something I thought about a lot in New York, and it starts with AVs, but it applies to AI too, which is these technologies are potentially astonishingly disruptive. And the workforce implications and all the other parts of it, I'll confess I worry that we'll figure out the technology perhaps before we figure out those other pieces. And as Andrei says, now sort of when these things really hit the streets, in the United States, there are 4 million people that drive for a living in one way or another. And it's a complicated question about a transition there. And likewise, listen, all of us are seeing what's being said about AI. It's already having some transformational impacts in transportation. The amount of data you can gather and analyze for safety, for mobility, for climate work, it's astonishing. But you've seen them articles that are saying, well, all those people who went to school to learn how to code, well, now AI is going to do it for them. So I guess I look at the human element, and as much as I think they could be really revolutionary in transportation, if we don't deploy them well, they can probably maybe cause more damage than good. We'll have to see.
And maybe just to add on that, I think we're talking about workforce. One of the things I hear the most from certainly our members is data scientists. We need more data scientists. We now have a lot of data, but we don't have people to analyze it. And you can do so much with AI. We still need the human touch. But I think that's an area of huge potential is indeed that data. So.
Sir, in the back.
Hi, thank you. I'm Chris from the class of 86. As you mentioned the challenge of stovepipe, particularly in American policymaking, and people don't live in a sector, their lives are much harder. So, Holly, you worked at the national policy level. Transportation is more than transportation. It's energy, it's environment, it's technology, it's housing. Any reflections of what it was like to work with the Domestic Policy Council on crafting a transportation policy?
That's a great question, and just for the record, my dear husband is here, who was at the Domestic Policy Council in the Obama years, who have a ringer in the room. I would say, as Petra said, right, like traditionally in the U.S., a lot of those disciplines are very stovepiped. And one thing, I was also at USDOT in the Obama administration, and we started to do some of that integrated thinking. We created what was called the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, which was DOT, HUD, which is our Housing and Urban Development Agency, and EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. I think in a European context, rather obvious notion that we should do transportation, housing, land use, and our environmental planning together. The hostility we met with on Capitol Hill were breathtaking, which is when you sort of talk about sort of jurisdictions and stovepiping, you have to also look at how our congressional committees work. It's a big, story I like to tell is back in the Obama administration, DOT and HUD together, between the two agents, we had like $100 million to put into planning grants, which in the context of the United States of America is not a big sum of money. And we decided to kind of put our programs together. And we went to tell our appropriators this, and DOT and HUD are in the same appropriation subcommittee, those who follow Congress. And our appropriators were screaming at us that it was outrageous that we were doing this. And I sort of said, well, doesn't it make sense to do transportation and housing planning together? And they said, well, of course it does, but you can't do that without our say-so. Congress has changed its tune a bit, I would say, in the past few months, and obviously granting this administration a lot more leeway to do that. I will say fast forward to the Biden administration, where we had a very affirmative mission to decarbonize the transportation sector. And we created something called the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. In the Obama years, DOT and Department of Energy didn't do that much together. In Biden, that was probably the agency I worked the most closely with. We had a whole program, as you know, to build out EV charging infrastructure, to look at, all the different transportation modes and how we could decarbonize, to bring kind of the scientific and the entrepreneurial side of DOE, which was spectacular, and marry it with sort of the DOT side of the house, which is we work with state and local transportation agencies and transit agencies, kind of, the folks on the ground who are doing the work in all its complexity and messiness. And I will admit, I thought it was an incredible partnership, so innovative, and now one, unfortunately, which has been put on ice. And I think it's the kind of partnership which it should have bipartisan support, because there was a lot of private sector involvement, a lot of ways of thinking through the market models for EV charging, for sustainable aviation fuel, for thinking about how to bring economics and market principles into some of that sustainability work. So I hope perhaps in the long run that integration will return. And when I'm asked now, like, what's the silver bullet for transportation? I say the silver bullet is we need to do transportation, housing, land use, energy. We need to do it all together. There's not one discipline that can tackle kind of the modern challenges we face.
But I'm looking at all the clocks here, which are antique, so out of time. Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. So, you lady, madam, right here. Thank you.
Hi. Anya, thank you for the discussion. My question is about another aspect that we were just talking about, integration of all of the various different aspects. And one of the things that I haven't heard you talk about yet is food access, supply chain distribution of agricultural or food goods, within cities, and at what point those types of considerations enter into your planning issues.
I think that might,
Thank you, Vice CEO.
I think I'll come to that one. Maybe I'll talk just a little bit at the start of the Biden administration as we were coming out of the pandemic. And as you know, we had incredible supply chain disruptions. And speaking of integration, one thing I'll give my White House credit for, they created what was called the Supply Chain Disruption Task Force. And it was every agency, but USDA had one of the most prominent seats at the table, Department of Energy, DOT, U.S. Trade Representative, thinking through all the disruptions we saw, but also trying to lay the groundwork for a better distribution system in the future. And, you all may remember in the early days of the Biden administration, all those ships sitting at anchor off the port of LA and Long Beach and working through that backlog, but then creating one thing we did at DOT, a data system. We actually worked very closely with USDA on it. To start to do information sharing, which, it's a very balkanized system in the freight bowl. There's a lot of private players, they have proprietary information, but to start creating an information sharing system, which we really didn't have at the national level, which I think you have more of in Europe. And again, with Department of Agriculture being a big player in thinking through food distribution at the national level and also at the local level.
The other part is food access is, can people access grocery stores? For touching on that as well, but we see that a lot in the cities we work with, especially as people who are low income get kind of pushed further and further out for the center. And so, one of the main use cases for especially cities in the U.S. to bring us in is to serve an area that is further out, that is like lacking access to transit. There's I feel like I don't know why I've mentioned Texas so many times. Like California is our biggest state, but anyway, Texas maybe number 2, but. There was an early story about a woman who wrote, one of our servers from California, who wrote in, who said that she was like, "Thank you so much for the service. I use it to go to the grocery store. I used to take the bus to the grocery store, but now for the first time in my life, for first time from adults, I can buy ice cream, because when I used to take the bus, I used to have to transfer. It would take me 2 hours to go there and get back. By the time I got home, the ice cream had melted, and now with your service, I can go purchase ice cream." So it's a little small example of impact of people's actual lives.
Well, on the ice cream notes, please stick around for the reception and join me. Thank you, this wonderful panel discussion.